Welcome and thank you for standing by. All participants are in a listen-only mode for the duration of today's conference, which is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. After the presentation, we will conduct a question-and-answer session, at which time, if you have a question, please press star 1 and record your first and last name when prompted. Your host for today is Ms. Irene Ahee. Thank you. You may begin.
Hello, and welcome to today's FDA webinar. I am Irene Ahee of CDRH's Office of Communication and Education. Today, we will be discussing the draft guidance document titled Framework for Regulatory Oversight of Laboratory Developed Tests, also known as LDTs, which published on October 3rd of this year. This draft guidance describes a risk-based framework for addressing the regulatory oversight of a subset of in vitro diagnostic devices, or IVDs, which are specifically referred to as laboratory developed tests, or LDTs. These products are evaluated in CDRH's Office of In Vitro Diagnostics and Radiological Health, also known as OIR. Today, Catherine Serrano, the Deputy Director in OIR's Division of Chemistry and Toxicology Devices, will present an overview of the draft guidance document. After her presentation, we will host a Q&A session during which Catherine will be joined by Dr. Alberto Gutierrez, the Director of OIR, and Dr. Elizabeth Mansfield of OIR's Personalized Medicine staff. Following today's webinar, the slide presentation, audio recording, and written transcript will be available on our website at www.fda.gov/CDRH webinar. Now, I give you Catherine.
Thank you so much. FDA is very happy to be here today to give this webinar to you folks. Before I get too deep into the meat of this webinar, I wanted to just provide sort of the purpose and what the scope is for this webinar today. So we'd like to provide you with an overview and some context for the proposed oversight framework, and also answer any clarifying questions that you may have about the specific proposals we have outlined in this draft guidance document. Our goal really is to be able to enable you to provide better feedback to the docket that has been created for this guidance document. And I did want to note that one thing that we aren't able to do today is actually receive comments from you on the draft guidance document. We need to follow the formal process of having folks submit those comments to the public docket so that they're recorded appropriately. And then also, in my question, in the question and answer period that will follow the sort of the formal presentation that I'll give, again, I'll ask you to sort of hold off on asking comments that go beyond what's in the guidance document. I can answer clarification questions about what our intention was with what was it is proposed in the guidance document, but anything beyond that does need to be submitted to as part of the formal comment process. So just to provide you with an overview of what I would like to get through today, I would like to provide some background for where we're at and how we got here, talk a little bit about our current proposal, and then discuss sort of the process and what the next steps are. So, in 1976, the medical device amendments were made to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that gave FDA the authority to regulate all in vitro diagnostic devices as devices, which included laboratory tests, and that is regardless of actually whether they were developed or manufactured by a laboratory or a conventional manufacturer. Now, with that said, FDA has generally used enforcement discretion for laboratory-developed tests, which we've defined to be tests that are intended for clinical use, designed, manufactured, and used within a single laboratory. Now, I have just a couple of notes about enforcement discretion to sort of put this in perspective. FDA typically uses enforcement discretion because of the risks associated, or how we view the risks associated with that category of tests, and in conjunction with our general resources. But I want to note that this is not a tool that we only have used for laboratory-developed tests. In fact, we've used this in many other areas where we feel that it's appropriate. I also want to note that enforcement discretion doesn't change the fact that the regulations do still apply. Now, as over the years, there has been an evolution in technology for LDTs, as well as how these tests have typically been marketed, and the business models that laboratories operate under. And while there are still many tests that exist that are identical to the ones that were under enforcement discretion back in 1976, there are also sort of these additional tests that have what we view as an increased risk associated with them. And as these changes have been occurring through technology, in the technology and business models, there have been it's been making it more apparent that there are gaps in certain areas with the oversight of these tests. Now, the consequences are that there have been, in some cases, significant adverse health events associated with incorrect results from these tests, which have led to unnecessary health care costs. And I think the concern is that from the community that this could actually undermine the progress that's been made in all of diagnostics, but particularly in the area of personalized medicine, which really does depend on tests that work well. Now, this is not just an issue that FDA has been concerned with. In fact, over the years, there have been several groups that have outlined concerns that they've had over this lack of regulatory oversight for laboratory-developed tests. Specifically in the 90s, the National Human Genome Research Institute had raised concerns. There were two Secretary Advisory committees that raised concerns about this in 2000 and 2008, and then also the Institute of Medicine raised concerns about laboratory-developed tests in 2012. To address these concerns, FDA actually has tried to take a number of different approaches over the years through the analyte-specific agent rule and also guidance documents associated with that, and then also through a draft guidance document called IVD-MIAs, which was published in 2005 and 6. Through these efforts, we have heard from stakeholders that really we need to take a more overarching approach to give better clarity to the community about where we're headed in terms of oversight for laboratory-developed tests so that they can plan appropriately. To sort of kick that idea off, in 2010, we actually did hold a public meeting to discuss these issues. If we were to have an overarching framework for LDTs, what should this framework look like? And the intention of that 2010 public meeting was really to gather input and concerns from stakeholders as we were moving forward in this process. Now, that public meeting was incredibly well attended. We had actually over 600 people participating on site and a couple hundred additional folks participating via webinar. We got a lot of feedback at the meeting and actually in the public docket following the meeting, and all of that feedback was considered as we were moving toward drafting this framework document. So because that framework really, or that feedback was really essential to how we began our process for drafting the draft guidance document, I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes talking about what we did hear from stakeholders. So specifically, we heard that no matter how we proceeded, it should be using a process that allows for stakeholder input and that can leverage external expert opinion on this topic. Almost every participant noted that we should use a risk-based strategy and that it would likely be appropriate to phase in that strategy over time to allow for greater planning on the part of labs, that we should provide some sort of a reasonable transition period so that laboratories could kind of get up to speed without really impacting their operations too much, and that we should provide a clear definition of laboratory-developed tests so that folks really understood which tests this applied to. Further, a lot of folks noted that we should have a registry, some sort of a way of collecting information on tests, and that we may want to partner with other agencies in order to get at this information. And then finally, that there needed to be sort of a process to address situations in which rapid developments of tests would be needed, for example, in emerging diseases or emergency situations. Now, additionally, stakeholders noted that there may be certain areas where less oversight may be appropriate, particularly in the situation with rare diseases, situations where there is no other FDA-approved or cleared alternative, in settings where there may be greater oversight by or greater interactions among the pathologist and physician that could help facilitate appropriate test interpretation and use, such as with a hospital-based test, tests that have a really extensive peer review, established peer review and a level of evidence associated with them, as well as tests that are performed in certain types of accredited labs or that have already received some sort of approval from New York State. We also heard from stakeholders that post-market surveillance, or MDR, or adverse event reporting was important and needed to protect public health, and that in any case, no matter how we proceeded, laboratories would likely need significant education on this oversight process. So that sort of leads into how we drafted or we developed the draft proposal, which was published earlier this month. Now, what we've proposed is that there will be certain categories of tests that are outside the scope of this framework, and essentially that would remain under enforcement discretion for all categories of requirements. These specific categories of tests include any test that's used just for forensic or law enforcement purposes, as well as certain tests used in high complexity histocompatibility laboratories for the purpose of transplantation. Now, all other laboratory developed tests outside of those two categories would actually be subject to some level of oversight under this framework. Specifically, all of these tests would be subject to registration and listing with an option for notification in order to collect basic information on those LDTs, as well as FDA would begin to enforce adverse event reporting requirements for all of those laboratory developed tests. Now, the idea with collecting this information is actually to create a basis of understanding of these tests and how they're used and how what issues or risks may be associated with them to feed into a public process that would use advisory panels and expert opinion to both classify devices that have never been classified under FDA's current system, as well as to provide recommendations to FDA on how we should prioritize our enforcement of applicable regulatory requirements on those devices. As part of that, we have actually identified certain categories of tests where we would be enforcing our pre-market review and quality system review requirements within a relatively short amount of time, so 1 year after the final guidance document was published. And then for the remaining category of tests, or the remaining LDTs, that advisory panel would inform how we would enforce those priorities using a phased-in enforcement approach over approximately 9 years. I should note, too, that certain areas will remain, or certain categories will remain under enforcement discretion for the pre-market review and quality system review requirements, and I'm going to talk about those in a moment. So one of those types of tests that will remain under enforcement discretion for pre-market review and quality system review requirements is traditional LDTs. Now, how FDA will sort of evaluate whether a test is a traditional LDT or not is by the following factors. One would be whether it's an LDT by the definition that we've put forth in this guidance document, in that it's designed, manufactured, and used within a clinical lab, a single lab. Whether it's manufactured and used by a healthcare facility lab for a patient that's being diagnosed and or treated at the same facility or within that facility's healthcare system. And just to provide you some context as to why we had included that factor, one of the areas that we had heard at the public meeting that helped mitigate the risk is good interactions and communication among the pathologist and the physician. The physician to help the pathologist understand sort of what the unique conditions may be on the part of the patient so that they could take those into account when they were determining which test was appropriate and how to interpret that test. And the pathologist actually being able to explain to the physician sort of any limitations or that might need to be taken into account when the physician is interpreting how to move forward clinically based upon that test result. So, by ensuring that this test be done within a healthcare system would ensure sort of common ownership as well as computer systems that could help facilitate these types of interactions. Another factor is whether or not that device is comprised of only components and instruments that are legally marketed for clinical use. And here what we're talking about are things like analyte-specific reagents, general-purpose reagents, or components or devices that have already been regulated by FDA. So, for example, things like microscopes or stains, which are already regulated, would be included in these types of components. And then finally, whether or not the test is interpreted by a quality lab professional without the use of automated instrumentation or software for interpretation. And the reason that we included this factor is really because we wanted to rely on sort of the expertise and training of the pathologist, which is regulated under CLIA, and not focus on software or instrumentation, which actually may need additional review to ensure that it's working appropriately. So another category that would remain under enforcement discretion for pre-market review and quality system review requirements would be LDTs for rare diseases. And how we've defined an LDT for rare disease is first whether or not it actually meets the definition of an LDT, and then further whether or not that test is performed less than 4,000 times per year, and that is based upon the definition in the humanitarian use device regulation. The third category that will remain under enforcement discretion for pre-market review and QS review requirements are LDTs for unmet needs. How the factors that we'll consider for this category of tests is, again, whether or not it meets the definition of an LDT, whether there's a cleared or approved IVD available for that specific intended use, and again, whether or not that device is performed within the same healthcare system under which the patient is being treated. So I think it's easier to think about these different categories by looking at a picture. So that's what we've tried to sort of put forth here. So you can see the top two, the LDTs for forensic and then the LDTs that are intended for transplantation. Those are outside the scope of this framework, and so we will not be enforcing any regulatory requirements on those two categories of tests. And then you can see below that there are other categories of tests, the low-risk class 1 devices, traditional LDTs, rare LDTs, and LDTs for unmet needs that will be subject to certain enforcement of certain requirements, namely registration listing or this optional notification and MDR reporting requirements, but will remain under enforcement discretion for pre-market review and quality system review requirements. So again, I think I like pictures. I think it's helpful. So we actually, there are timelines associated with when the different requirements will actually kick in for various categories of tests. So for all of the tests that are subject to registration listing with the optional notification as well as MDR reporting requirements, that will begin 6 months following final publication of this guidance document. Now, after that, the highest risk classes of tests, the ones that we've already indicated we will begin to enforce our pre-market review requirements on, those will be subject to those requirements after 1 year following final publication of the guidance document. Now, any subsequent test will actually be the exact timing for when those we will enforce pre-market review requirements will depend on sort of the information and the recommendations we receive from the advisory committees. But we are estimating that we would target high-risk LDTs within 2 and 5 years of the final guidance publishing, and moderate-risk LDTs between years 5 and 9 following final publication of the guidance document. So just to sort of clarify this in another way, at the time the final guidance publishes, if there is no existing LDT on the market, they will actually need to, so if a new LDT comes on the market that's in the highest risk category of tests, which we've identified will be the first up for enforcement of pre-market review requirements, those before they come on the market would actually be subject to pre-market review requirements. So they could not enter the market without making a submission and receiving approval from the FDA. At 6 months following the final publication of the guidance document, we would begin to enforce registration listing or the optional notification and then adverse event reporting for all currently marketed LDTs, except those two categories which we've indicated are outside the scope of this guidance document. I should note that after that 6-month time point, any new LDTs that enter the market actually should notify prior to marketing that device. And any significant changes to an intended use of an existing LDT should actually, again, re-notify before they begin offering that test to patients. At 1 year, I've already stated that we will begin to enforce the pre-market requirements for those LDTs in the 3 categories that are first up for enforcement of pre-market review requirements. Should note that there is a requirement that they comply with QS Reg at the time that they make the PMA submission, and compliance with the registration and listing also at the time that they make the PMA submission. One thing I do want to note is that we will not be asking the laboratories with these tests to remove these tests from the market while they're under review. In fact, they can remain on the market while they're under review, while we're working with those laboratories to obtain approval for the devices. The only point at which they would have to come off the market is if we go through the review process and are unable to approve them. So if we have to actually disapprove those tests because we have found issues with the the safety and effectiveness of those tests, at that point they would have to come off the market. But before that point is reached, they would not. So within the 2-year process, or within the first 2 years, as I noted, we would be collecting that information on registration and listing and notification and adverse event reporting and giving that to external advisory groups. Those groups would be helping us to classify and prioritize the remaining high-risk LDTs. And so at 2 years, we would expect to actually publish a guidance document which would give information on classification and then also provide a timeline for how we will enforce the remaining or the regulatory requirements for the remaining high-risk LDTs. And that's what so I'll skip to the next one. So at 3 years, the group that the advisory panel indicates would be next up for enforcement of pre-market review requirements, at 3 years they would be subject to those requirements and would need to make their regulatory submissions. And then we would complete all the remaining high-risk LDTs according to that priority order by year 5. And also, we will, in this time period, we will be getting public input from the advisory panels on how to prioritize the moderate risk LDTs. A document would publish at year 4, which would indicate the order in which those moderate risk LDTs should come in for enforcement of pre-market review requirements, and that the enforcement of those requirements would occur between years 5 and 9. So where are we today? Today we're actually somewhere over here, well beyond, before this timeline actually starts. This timeline actually is triggered by the publication of the final guidance document, and because we are only at the draft stage, we are not actually enforcing any requirements prior to this point. So what's next is actually that right now we're sort of in the public comment period of the guidance document. So we actually issued a longer than normal public period. We've allowed for 120 days to receive public comment. We plan to have a public workshop in January. We hope that you all can participate and provide feedback to us at that point. And our goal really is to be interactive with you folks. This is a very complex area, and we want to be able to be working with people to refine this proposal and ensure that any oversight proposal that we have is really made in the best interest of public health. Beyond that public comment period, what FDA typically does with guidance documents is to analyze all of the public input that we've received and incorporate the appropriate revisions in a final guidance document. And that publication of the final guidance document would take some time, given the fact that we do have to go through this process of incorporating that public input and considering that public input into the final version. Only at the point that we've published a final guidance document will we begin to implement what's outlined in this framework. So, I think we've received some question about, okay, so what can I comment on? And really, anything in the draft guidance document is up for comment and discussion. And I've provided there have been specific areas that FDA has asked stakeholders to comment on, and you can find a list of those in the Notice of Availability, or the FR notice, which I think is less familiar to some people, but we've tried to make it a little bit more accessible by putting it on our website at www.fda.gov/LDTs, and you can find a list of the specific question FDA would like stakeholder input on. And I'm going to go through those as well. But even if people have questions or comments that are beyond the scope of those items that we've identified on this website, we want to hear about it. And we hope that you would provide those comments to us. Specific things that FDA has already identified that we would like some comment and assistance from the community is particularly in the categories that will remain under enforcement discretion. So the first category of traditional LDTs, in general, we would like comment about whether or not these risk mitigations that we've identified here are sufficient, or whether there may be additional risk mitigations that we should consider for this category of tests. Or additionally, whether or not this category of tests should be subject to enforcement discretion with respect to registration and listing as well. Now, LDTs for rare diseases, one of the questions that we would hope that people would comment on is specifically whether or not the factors that are outlined are appropriate. So is it necessary that these LDTs also that actually meet the definition of an LDT, and then also is the number 4,000 per year appropriate, or should there be another way to define what a LDT for rare disease is? Now, LDTs for unmet needs, specifically, one of the things that we struggled with when we were drafting the guidance document was how to appropriately balance the need to have patient access to tests, especially in areas where there is no FDA cleared or approved alternative, while mitigating the risks associated with it. What we have proposed here is to use this, to restrict the use of that to this healthcare facility or the healthcare system under which the lab and the patient are being treated. So that has been our proposal. We would like input on from folks on whether or not we should define that healthcare system differently, or whether there are other factors that we could consider for mitigating the risks associated with LDTs for unmet needs while still allowing patient access to these tests. Some other things that could be clarified in these guidance documents, which we've already begun to hear from stakeholders that people could comment on, are how to interpret, how to interpret what elements make up a medical device, what might constitute the label or labeling for a device, whether or not UDI, the unique device identification requirements, apply to LDTs, and how laboratory physician communication about a test and its result would be viewed by FDA. Now, if you would like to make a comment on the guidance document, today I focused mostly on the draft guidance, the overarching framework guidance document, but there were actually two guidance documents that were published. The other one was called the Notification or MDR draft guidance document. Each of these documents have a specific docket associated with it, which is listed here, that you can submit comments to. If you have any questions, we do have an FDA mailbox available, so you can send questions to that mailbox. Again, this is not the appropriate place to make actual comments on the guidance document. We're hoping that the questions in here that would be submitted to this mailbox would be more clarification in nature, so that you can make more appropriate comments to the actual public docket. But we wanted to mention that this was available. And then also, we will be making this slide presentation, transcript, and webinar recording available at the following sites. And we're estimating that this would be available by no later than next Friday. And so thank you very much for your attention, and we can now move toward the question and answer portion of this webinar.
Thank you. I would like to remind all audio participants, if you have a question, please press *1 and state your name clearly when prompted. One moment, please, for our first question. Once again, please press *1 for your question. First question comes from Amy Miller.
Hi, thank you very much for the overview. It was very helpful. My question is, can we expect to see a second draft of these guidance documents before finalization? And I ask because as a coalition, we've heard a variety of different suggestions for additions to them, and I think it would be helpful if a second draft went out for public comment before finalization. Is that FDA's intent currently, or is that open?
Thanks, Amy. That's a good question, actually. Typically with guidance documents, the way that we determine whether or not a second draft is needed is how significant the revisions are going to be in response to the comments that we've gotten on that public docket. I think at this point, it's a little tough to say whether or not we would have a second draft or not, but again, if the revisions are significant, then we do typically do a second round of draft. And the only other thing that I want to mention is sort of emphasize that when you ask a question, if you could please state both your name but also your affiliation, I think it will help us provide some context for that question as well.
Thank you, Personalized Medicine Coalition.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Christina Yen. Your line is
open. Hi, this is Christina Yen from Beckman Coulter. I wonder, could you please help to understand what kind of impact to medical tax or users' fees?
So I think the impact to medical techs, I think from FDA's perspective, there would not be an impact. This is what FDA focuses more on is the actual evaluation of the test itself and how it performs, and as well as the quality systems associated with it. And we do not focus typically on the personnel associated with running a test. That's typically more evaluated under CLIA. And so I hope that's helpful.
I'm sorry, maybe I did not ask it clearly. I'm talking about like 2.3% medical tax and also, users fee like Medufa 4 in the future.
Oh, okay, the medical device tax. That's actually how the medical device tax is implemented and who it applies to is actually not under FDA's purview. It's under the IRS's purview, so unfortunately I can't actually answer that question today.
Our next question comes from Mr. Benecki. Your line's open.
Hi, this is Mike Benecki from GSK. I had a question with regard to, let's say, tests and the guidance that fall within the gaps. It's my like, for example, a companion diagnostic test for a rare disease orphan drug indication versus an LDT that is used to diagnose a rare disease or unmet medical condition that's used as a primary study inclusion for a therapeutic trial. So essentially, a companion diagnostic test for a very rare disease.
Hi, this is Liz Mansfield. I'll be taking this question. Hi, Mike. I think the answer to this is the companion diagnostic requirements would trump the LDT guidance in that case. We have been working on how we would work to approve a device for a rare disease that was a companion diagnostic, and we'll be addressing that in a separate forum.
Thank you very much.
Our next question comes from Naomi Aronson.
Yes, Naomi Aronson, Blue Cross and Blue Shield Association. I'm interested to understand how you are defining the reporting of adverse events, since in large the significant adverse events of a test are misdiagnosis, and that gets us into the area of performance. So how are you planning to define this for reporting purposes?
So the current MDR regulations actually specify that it includes both actual death, serious injury, or a malfunction that could have led to death or serious injury. So in the case of LDTs, it would be the same. I think, of course, with IVDs in general, I think it's harder to identify in some cases where actual incorrect results have led to a patient harm or could have led to a patient harm, but where a laboratory would identify, or a manufacturer of an IVD would actually identify that those events were occurring. In those cases, we would be expecting that they report those tests. And I think one thing that I wanted to mention, I think there's some misconceptions that FDA would be asking laboratories to sort of go out fishing or doing something different to identify cases in which their tests would be causing harm. In fact, that's not how our MDR regulations work. It's more of a passive system where the manufacturers, when they receive reports that their devices had some sort of issue that has either led to death, injury, or could have led to death or injury, then they have the systems in place to report those events to the FDA. But they are not typically required to have systems where they're actively going out and looking for those issues. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Martha Rittliddle.
Yes, this is Martha Riddle with Natomics. My question is regarding just a gap I wasn't clear on, a little clarification. For a currently marketed high-risk LDT that is not equivalent to any currently approved Class 3 device, is PMA approval required or PMA submission required at that 12-month time period from the issuance of the final guidance?
It would be a submission. So I think that's actually a very important point, because as you know, the pre-approval, between the time that you make a pre-approval submission and hopefully receive approval, there might be a time lag there. And we wanted to make sure that we were being as minimally invasive as possible for those tests that were already out there. So we actually we would be enforcing the fact that these tests make a submission at the 12-month point after the final guidance is published, and they could remain on the market through that submission process until, and as soon as they receive approval, they would be good to go. Only in the cases where they actually receive a disapproval would they have to bring their device off the market.
Okay, thank you very much.
Our next question comes from Tom Levicki.
Yeah, Tom Levicki from Marshfield Clinic in Wisconsin. So regarding the PMA and 510K processes, so my understanding, I haven't done any myself, my understanding is they are very resource intensive and can be even a challenge for commercial manufacturers. So I'm wondering, I have several questions. First of all, will clinical efficacy need to be included, clinical efficacy studies? The second thing I'm curious about is if you have any data on the actual ability of individual hospital laboratories to really practically be able to follow this rule. And thirdly is my personal suspicion is that this is in effect going to force many LDTs off the market because the hospital laboratories will not have the resources to really comply with the FDA rule. Thoughts?
Yes, hello, this is Alberto Gutierrez. So the bar for FDA approval clearance is clinical validity, not clinical utility. So the type of information that we ask for is to make sure that your test has some clinical relevance. That bar is actually not, and typically is believed to be that the agency requires, controlled trials to be able to get information. That bar actually is not that. We believe that most of the tests that are being provided to patients should have clinical validity, and in all cases, even though CLIA doesn't require it, most people think that they're providing actually clinically valid tests, and we believe patients actually believe they're getting clinically valid tests. So it is that data that we think needs to be reviewed by a third party, and that needs to be assessed for whether the test actually works or not. Whether laboratories will be, we do actually think that laboratories will be able to submit. We actually have many cases where small companies have come through both clearly through the 510K process, but also through the PMA process. And so we actually believe that it is a process that can be done, and that will result in submissions and in good tests. We don't. The purpose for doing this is not to actually prevent laboratories from developing their tests. It is really just to assure that the tests that are being developed and provided are clinically significant and appropriate, and the patient's actually protected. We actually have the center particularly has always been one that has helped small manufacturers, and we expect that the same type of help we'll give to laboratories, and we'll be able to help them go through the system.
Okay, let me add a little bit. This is Liz Mansfield. I want to make sure that people understand that where clinical validity has been well established in the literature, we can also accept peer-reviewed published literature, clinical practice guidelines, and so on as part of or all of the evidence for clinical validity for tests. So there is no need in many cases to regenerate this clinical data.
Our next question comes from Ms. Kumidi Data. Your line is open.
My question has already been asked, replied by the speaker. Thank you.
Our next question comes from Mr. Matt Luff. Your line is open.
I think there's something like 11,000 CLIA labs in the United States. This seems like it's going to be a massive increase in the workload of the FDA, which is already very heavily worked. I'm wondering if you've projected the cost of running this program and what that is likely to translate into in terms of user fees.
Well, so the reason that we had taken, part of the reason that we had taken a phased-in approach was actually to be able to address the scope of laboratory developed tests using the resources that we do currently have. I know that you had mentioned that there are 11,000, I believe, high complexity CLIA laboratories, or I think it's something important to note that not all 11,000 would actually be necessarily manufacturing laboratory developed tests. We've tried to do analysis of how many laboratory developed tests are out there in a couple of different ways, and both ways that we have actually done that analysis, that we believe we could actually handle using this phased-in approach. With respect to user fees, I wanted to point out, too, that under the current agreement that we have with industry, we would actually not be enforcing user fee requirements on laboratory developed tests. I think whether or not laboratory developed tests would be subject to user fees is a topic for discussion in future negotiations.
Our next question comes from Mr. Philip Novales.
This is Philip Novales from Grifols Diagnostic Solutions. My question pertains to what the subtle differences are between LDTs and ASRs and multivariate assays. Now, said in a different way, would a lab be able to use ASRs or even RUOs in the development and manufacture of LDTs?
Right. So an ASR, an analyte-specific reagent, is considered a component, probably a key component of a test, which may be a laboratory-developed test. Typically, research use only components because the intention of them is really to be used for research purposes. A laboratory could include those as a component of a laboratory-developed test, but they may need to address sort of the quality of that component in some way. But yes, it's possible that those could be incorporated as a component of a laboratory-developed test. Now, IVD-MIAs is a little bit different. That's typically more of a software algorithm that incorporates the values for many different laboratory tests and generates a result. That, to us, is considered to be a software as part of a medical device, and so that would be considered part of also a component of a laboratory-developed test.
Our next question comes from Dr. Moradami.
Hello. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My question goes to regarding again laboratory tests developed on mass spec in hospital settings, such as vitamin D or pain management. So how FDA views that type of test with regards to regulations?
Well, so a test, let's say, using mass spec to measure something like vitamin D in a hospital situation, I think we would, because you're using that information to inform a clinical decision, we would consider that to be a test, and it could be considered to be a laboratory-developed test. So it would be subject to this framework as one of a laboratory-developed test.
Right. How about pain management as well? That basically those drugs are measured in the urine for compliance monitoring. So those are also considered as laboratory-developed tests. But how this document address those tests? So
I think it's the advisory panel, those would be considered to be laboratory-developed tests subject to the proposal in this framework. Those specific tests are not called out in the highest risk category of tests, and so they will, the advisory panel will determine sort of at what time period we would actually enforce the pre-market review requirements. You should note vitamin D, for example, is a class 2 device, so that would be in that moderate category, which would be addressed sometime between years 5 and 9.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Our next question comes from Latine. Ms. Ladine, your line is open.
Hi, this is Dr. Katia Ladine with the Napa Solano Yolo Marin County Public Health Laboratory. And my question was whether public health laboratories are considered to be inside or outside the scope of this framework, and if anybody has asked about that previously.
Sure, thank you. No, we do consider public health laboratories to be inside the scope of this framework. I should note we have a history of working with the CDC on tests that have been distributed out through the public health laboratories for emerging diseases, for example, things that require emergency use authorizations. We've already been using that emergency use authorization process to actually ensure the quality of those tests and their performance. So I think we have established, a process for that. Anything beyond that would still be under the scope of this guidance document.
Okay, so we're hoping to provide some input because public health laboratories are really not mentioned within any part of the document. They seem to be, kind of missing, so it doesn't, we're curious about how they fit into the framework.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we'd be, as with any group, we'd be happy to talk with you if you have specific concerns.
Thank you very much.
Our next question comes from Mr. Steve Corvera. Your line is open, sir.
Yes, hi, Steve Barbera with Pacific Edge. Thanks for putting this together. It's been very helpful. I think my question may have been answered, but I'll put it out there. A lot of us that have products out on the market currently and that are seeking coverage through the payers and so forth are putting data together. It's said in the draft proposal that existing data could be submitted and considered for the PMA process, which you pointed out with clinical validity to be available. If a company were to proactively, ahead of the curve, submit that data, but kind of not understanding what exactly would be required, and that data was not supported, would that be an official denial of pre-market approval, or would there be an opportunity to augment that data so you could stay on the market? As you can imagine, that would be pretty critical.
Right. I think it depends what's going on. What I would recommend is for anybody in this situation, I would recommend that you come in. We have a mechanism called a pre-submission where we can actually interact on what it is that you're trying to do with your device and ask us specific questions on the data that you're trying to generate or the data that you have, and whether or not there's additional data or information that we may need to support approval. That's actually a really great way to get feedback without having to make a formal regulatory submission. That's open to anyone that wants to use that process, including folks in this group. So I think the best way to do that is there's information on the FDA website about the pre-submission process, and certainly you can email that LDT framework if you have specific questions on how to do that, and we can get you set up with the right information.
And if you'd like to find guidance on that topic, the simplest way to find the guidance is to Google pre-submission and FDA, and it should be the first document that shows up.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Our next question comes from Ginger Wooster. Your line's open.
Thank you. This is Ginger Wooster with Orchard Software. Currently, laboratory information systems which manage orders and results in the lab and are external to medical devices are considered Class 1 exempt. Do you have plans to make any changes for the LIS with respect to LDTs?
That is not in the scope of sort of what we've considered in this guidance document, and I think I just want to reemphasize that anything that is Class 1 under this framework would not be subject to enforcement discretion for pre-market review requirements.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Mr. McGowan.
Hi, thank you very much. This is Scott McGowan with ACLA, and I actually had a couple of questions that I wanted to raise. Number one being that early in your presentation you had stated that there were a number of examples of direct harm that had come as a result of laboratory-developed tests, and I was wondering whether or not you would be able to provide examples. I also believe that the Hill had asked that information be made available to the community during the September 9th hearing in front of the House Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee. So if you could speak to that, that would be terrific. Secondly, with regards to quality systems regulation requirements, in that Dr. Sureness stated that the agency has no intent to release that third guidance document, which was discussed back in 2010, whether or not laboratories would have an opportunity to comment on anything prior to them being subject to that regulation, because under the current framework, for laboratories upon submission of a PMA, which could begin as soon as 12 months after the finalization of a guidance, they would be required to follow through and abide by QSR requirements, but there isn't a clear explanation of how those would apply in a laboratory setting. And then thirdly, getting to that user fee negotiation that was mentioned earlier, you stated that the user fees could be renegotiated going forward in subsequent UFA, but in that we have 3 years until the next UFA would take over, and there's a 2% limitation on waiver authority, meaning that laboratory developed tests cannot be charged user fees, and the agency can only waive 2% of the preceding year's total user fee haul. How do you view that as limiting the agency to carry out the task that they're laying out in this rather broad document?
Sure. So I'll address the first one, which was about examples. I think we have provided, Dr. Suren in his testimony and in other discussions that we've had about this topic, we have provided examples. We have a number. One of the ones that Dr. Suren and actually the Commissioner have talked about is Overshore. There was a test that it was an IVD MIA that where women were actually, in some cases, it was telling them whether their risk of developing ovarian cancer. And some women we knew had actually gone out and had hysterectomies as a result of that test when it may or may not have been correct. There's the case of at Dartmouth where there was a whooping cough outbreak that was likely not an outbreak, but it had been, a lot of people had received antibiotics and were subject to additional testing because of results from an LDT. There have been a number of things written in the New York Times about vitamin D testing, et cetera. I think we are preparing a formal response to the Hill and to the request that we've been asked to make for the Hill. I'll be frank, some of the information that FDA has is not public because of the nature of our work, and so we can't share it publicly. And also, we are limited by the fact that we have not been able to systematically collect information about adverse event reporting because of enforcement discretion. So, even with all of that, we have received a significant number of information from various sources about situations. And certainly it's not just FDA that thinks, that has this opinion that there have been harms. Certainly there have been external articles written about this. There were several advisory panel committees, as I mentioned, that had noted these issues and made recommendations to the FDA based on those issues. So I just wanted to point that out. But certainly, I think the examples that we do have, we are looking for a way to share them with the public. With respect to QS Reg, it's a tricky area. On the one hand, the regulations are already written to be very broad and applicable to a very, very broad audience, both in terms of what types of devices are subject to them as well as what types of operations are subject to them. And what I mean by that is they're meant to encompass anything from a guy that's making something in his garage all the way up to a very sophisticated, large multinational company that is making medical devices. So they're written, and some devices as simple as a toothbrush all the way up to something very complex like an LVAD. So, certainly they're very broad. When you're talking about something that's so broad, giving really specific feedback on how an individual lab could actually implement that system in the context of what they're already currently doing, I think is just really difficult because among laboratories, you will have a very wide variety of how each of you actually implements, for example, the CLIA regulations or any accreditation regulations that you may have. So I think that was that's part of the issue. With that said, we agree that there needs to be help by FDA and other organizations to labs to help them figure out how these regulations can actually be met using a lot of the processes and procedures that they already have in place. And we're actually working toward getting you more specific materials, educational and outreach materials that can help you with that. So there will be an opportunity for people to get access to that type of information. Now, finally, the last question you had was with respect to user fees. Certainly, anybody can guess and postulate on what will happen in those negotiations. In fact, every time we go through these negotiation processes, it's sort of a mystery what happens. So I can't comment on what will happen 3 years from now. I can tell you in the immediate term, as I mentioned, we're not actually at the stage where we're even talking about implementing these guidance documents. We're at the draft stage. We're collecting comments. We're collecting information from the stakeholder community to move toward a final guidance document. And because of that, I can't postulate how many LDTs will actually be required to come in under the framework in the next 3 years. But I think right now the better focus is to make comments so that we can all work toward a more appropriate oversight framework that we can live under.
Our next question comes from Mr. Stephen Day. Your line is open.
Hi, this is Stephen Day, and I'm unaffiliated. As you pointed out earlier, it's clear that it regulates the personnel requirements for testing in laboratories. However, it's the FDA that assigns the clear complexity level to those tests. It's the same framework that's currently used to assign those to manufacturers' tests, commercial manufacturers' tests, going to be used to assign clear complexity levels to the LDTs as they go through this framework?
That's correct. That would be the same system. I mean, I think the only thing that I note is that right now LDTs are actually subject to the highest level of complexity because of the nature of being a laboratory-developed test. And so there is actually, going through the FDA process, there's a way that laboratories may actually be able to have a lower complexity test instead of that highest level of complexity.
Our next question comes from Megan Gordon-Dunn. Your line is open.
Thank you, and thank you for putting this together. So my question is about genetic profile panels. So the way that I understand the guidance is that LDTs are approved for certain conditions, but how will that apply to genetic profile panels for use in determining which clinical trial or off-label use of drugs might be open to patients based on genetic mutations? For example, if a test for RAS has already been approved by the time this guidance goes into effect, would a potential panel not be able to include a RAS test, or would that still be open on the panel?
So that's a very good question, and one that we have put a lot of thought towards, and that is not addressed in the guidance. This is Liz Mansfield, by the way. What our current belief is that if the panel contains a marker that is approved as a companion diagnostic, we would consider at least that marker to be a companion diagnostic. If the panel includes other markers that are not related to the use of that companion diagnostic, it's unclear exactly how we would handle that right now, and we would love to hear your comments in the comment period about how we should handle that.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Our next question comes from Jerry Hearn. Ms. Hearn, your line's open.
Hi, this is Sherry Hearn. I'm calling from the Oregon State Public Health Lab. I was hoping to get some more information about how this guidance is going to apply in the circumstance of screening tests, in particular newborn screening tests that are frequently done on hundreds of thousands of children. And if, because it's a screening test and not a confirmatory test, if this guidance would apply. I was also interested in getting more information about how the test for rare diseases would apply in the cases of outbreak situations where you might normally only perform 10 or 20 of a particular test in a year, but during an outbreak situation you might be asked to do several thousand, and how the FDA would address those situations and the changing needs of state public health labs.
Okay, so I'll address the first question first about things like the screening tests. Those would be considered LDTs that would be subject to this framework. And I think, again, it would be up to sort of that advisory panel to determine what their relative risk was and where they should fall in terms of when we would begin to enforce the pre-market review requirements on those that have actually not, that don't have an FDA-approved equivalent. Now, with respect to rare disease testing, this is actually an area that we, again, as was noted, we have provided, we've thought a lot about, but we haven't addressed that issue that you mentioned where the outbreak situation. We may have a mechanism already to deal with this, which could be the existing emergency use authorization mechanism. But again, if you have additional ideas on how we could address the specific issue of rare diseases and how we might need to modify that definition to address some of these issues, we would love to hear that in the comments.
Okay, thank you.
Our next question comes from Christine Gathers.
Hi, this is Christine Gathers from Eli Lilly and Company. We have a clarification question regarding the guidance scope and wanted to verify that it's directed just to commercial LDTs, or does the guidance also apply to LDTs used for R&D purposes? Thank you.
So the guidance would only apply to those LDTs that are being used for clinical use. If you're using them for R&D purposes, you're not, and I'll be more specific, purposes where you're not actually reporting that result back to the patient or that don't meet the definition of a significant risk device requiring other actions under our regulations, then those would be outside the scope of this guidance. But if you're actually performing those tests on patients and giving them the result, or that you meet the definition of a significant risk device, even during your R&D purposes, those would be subject to this guidance.
Thank you.
The next question comes from Art Komasaki.
Hello, Art Kawasaki, care of Canon U.S. Life Sciences. I have a follow-up scope clarification question that is aligned with the question I was just asked and one prior regarding RUO components. I wanted to know if there's an impact, if any, to the manufacturer of an RUO-labeled instrument system that's used by a lab to develop an LDT for patient management or treatment decisions.
I think that those responsibilities would be the same that they already are, so this wouldn't impact those responsibilities.
Okay, thank you.
Our next question comes from Pat Smith.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for today. This is Pat Smith, Lyme Disease Association. And I have two quick questions. One concerns the expert panels the advisory panels that you intend to convene. I would like to know how those panel members will be selected, what the criteria would be, and particularly how would they be screened for conflicts of interest. That's question number one. And question number two is those individuals or entities who have expressed opinions that existing tests are harmful, I'd like to find out if their comments were considered in light of any conflicts of interest they may have had. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. So with respect to the panels and the advisory panels that we would use, typically what I can say is what we have done in the past when we've had panel meetings, and FDA has panel meetings at some frequency. We did this after the initial 1976 medical device amendments were passed to actually classify devices, and we continue to have panel meetings when we're making decisions that are controversial or that can really impact the respective field. We have a lot of rules for how those panels are made up and who's on them. They typically include a wide variety of experts in that field and different stakeholders. So, for example, patient groups are represented on those panels as well. And there is an extensive screening process for conflicts of interest for the members of those panels, and specifically the types of issues that they're asked to address in their panel meeting. Now, with respect to how FDA has evaluated the situations where we've heard of harm, we have carefully evaluated all of the evidence, including the source of the evidence. Some of the time, that's why it's difficult for us to actually give public information out about what exactly we have heard, because sometimes because of the sources, we're not actually able to share that information. So we have considered all of that information when we're making these evaluations.
This is Alberto Gutierrez. I wanted to add, so that it is understood, the panels that we'll be putting together will only dwell onto the risk of the devices and when they have to come in. There may be cases when we have devices that are going through the process, the approval or clearance process, but then there are cases where we actually take those devices to panels themselves. And so that may be also a time when a panel will be put together and when there'll be a chance to have public comment and actually the process of determining whether a device is safe and effective is open to a broader discussion by stakeholders.
Our next question comes from Angela Taka-Rush.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for putting on the webinar. This is Angela Taka with Roche Molecular. My question goes to Dr. Gutierrez. Dr. Gutierrez, you mentioned that the bar for LDTs is clinical validity, not clinical utility. My question to you is, will this also shape or inform the requirements for clinical utility demonstrations by IVD manufacturers? Thank you.
So the bar of clinical validity is actually the one that we use for all IVDs. We don't actually look at clinical utility, we look at clinical validity.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Mary Williams. Ms. Williams, your line is open.
Hello, thank you. Association for Molecular Pathology. This isn't the only guidance that that laboratories need to follow to understand what requirements are associated with this oversight. Will there be a catalog or library where laboratories can find all of the other guidance documents, for example, for companion diagnostics and the variety of guidances for industry that are in existence?
Yeah, we have a website where all of our guidance documents are published. I think you're asking for something a little bit more specific, somewhere where that they can more easily get to the ones that are specifically applicable to laboratories. And I think that certainly that's something that, please submit that in a form of comment. I think that's definitely something that we could easily do.
Our next question comes from Richard Robinson.
Hi, Richard Robinson from American Red Cross. My concern is with respect to the serological tests, LDTs, done to determine red cell compatibility, which were specifically called out as being among the top tier for enforcement under the new guidance. I wonder if you could I have several questions. I wonder if you could clarify well, let me back up. There are a number of laboratory-developed tests that are described in peer-review, copyrighted journals, serological tests for determining red cell compatibility in situations where there's no commercial kit available. And I'm a little unclear how any one particular lab could submit a pre-market authorization for a serological test that's described in a peer-reviewed journal. And if they did, these tests are widely used in blood bank reference labs. Would each laboratory be required to submit a pre-market authorization for each of those tests? Third question is, even if the user fee was waived for the pre-market submission, there's still a user fee associated with the device establishment registration, correct? And the fourth question, last question, is even in the event, even with the best, all of the testing that goes on, patients still react to red cell transfusions. Wouldn't some sort of a red cell transfusion reaction trigger a medical device report in each time it happens?
So, unfortunately, we don't have our CBER colleagues here. They are the experts on these particular set of questions. So I would actually encourage you to submit your specific questions to the LDT Framework email that I've provided, and I can actually get you the best answer to that possible. Regarding the user fee question that you have, right now under the current MDUFA, the fact that user fees are not collected applies to any user fee. And the device establishment registration, that's part of the registration and listing fee, and that actually is included in that. So that at this point, under this MDUFA agreement, we would not be collecting user fees for that. Additionally, you'll note that we actually have provided an alternative to formal registration and listing for all of the laboratory-developed tests that aren't actively being regulated for pre-market review and quality system regulation requirements. That notification, we actually created that as an alternative because we wanted to kind of get around the user fee issue for tests that weren't actively being regulated, so that we would have a mechanism for getting at what was being offered and getting that information to feed into the advisory panel process, and also to be a resource to the community to know what tests are actually being offered, but without having to trigger that notification or that registration and listing fee that would be associated with that.
Regarding the NDR, I'm sorry, Liz Mansfield, regarding the NDR reporting, we are aware that no test is perfect and that there will be results that could cause, for example, as you said, red cell reactions. Would that be reportable as a medical device report? The answer is yes. If you believe it caused a serious injury or death, or a malfunction that has the potential to cause serious injury or death. Now, reporting in a medical device report does not mean that you must take your product off the market or that FDA will necessarily take any action. It's our way of monitoring tests over time to assure that if there are systematic problems, they can be addressed appropriately.
I think that's a good point by Liz, and I think I just want to follow up on it too. Certain types of devices, we don't typically see a lot of MDRs, and so any MDR might initiate some interest on FDA's perspective, and we would reach out to the company and kind of try to figure out what was going on. But with other devices, I can tell you, for example, in the glucose area, we received so many MDRs for glucose meters that we don't follow up with every single individual report that we receive. We evaluate them, we monitor them, we look at sort of frequencies and compare frequencies, but each individual report would not be actionable.
Our next question comes from Nancy Yote. Ms. Yote, your line's open.
Thank you for the seminar. It's been very good. This is Nancy Yote from Brandwood Biomedical. My question is, if a clinical lab has developed an LDD and they decide or they wish to license it to another laboratory, does this move the test into the commercial IVD category requiring a 510K or PMA submission?
Well, so, I mean, I think under FDA's definition, yes, but what we have tried to do in the framework is actually a lot. We know that this goes on a lot, and because I think we felt that it was more important to sort of move forward with the framework than to get stuck in a discussion with what does or does not meet the definition of an LDT. Mm-hmm. What we have stated in the guidance document is that if you're calling it an LDT, regardless of whether it meets that strict definition that we've outlined in the guidance document, this framework will apply.
Okay.
Now, for the categories that will remain under enforcement discretion, if the category has under it a factor stating that it needs to meet the definition of an LDT, it does actually need to meet that strict definition to be eligible to remain under enforcement discretion. And so in your particular case and in that scenario that you had outlined, they may not be able to be considered, for example, as an LDT for an unmet need. But again, those factors are under discussion. You can certainly comment on them in the formal process and give us your opinion as to whether you think that is or is not an effective mitigation of risk.
Okay, thank you.
Our next question is Diana Lane. Ms. Lane, your line is open.
Hi, this is Diana Lane from Natera, and I have two questions. The first question is in regard to what would happen if a high-risk test that currently does not have an approved alternative is being marketed, but then a competitor gets approval during that T0 to 2-year window before the prioritization guidance is published by the panel. Would there be some sort of grace period to get a submission in? Because that would move the affected test up to the immediate category that was supposed to have started submissions in 1 year.
So actually the guidance does talk about this point in that, especially for those tests that are in the highest risk categories, the ones that will be subject to enforcement discretion. As you mentioned, there may be a device in that time period, let's say at year 2, that comes on the market that actually receives PMA approval. So at that point, what the guidance says for the LDTs for unmet needs is that there's basically other tests on the market with that same intended use would have a year in order to make a submission, a regulatory submission. Now again, they would remain on the market while that regulatory submission was being reviewed. So they would have essentially a year grace period to get their documentation together and make that FDA submission, and then they would be able to remain on the market until FDA issues the approval or hopefully approval. Only if they receive a disapproval would they have to come off the market.
All right, thank you for clarifying that. For my second question, you mentioned during your presentation that recognition of New York State approvals had been proposed in 2010, but that suggestion didn't appear in the draft guidance, at least as I read it. So for tests that already have New York State approvals, would there be any recognition of that approval in facilitating FDA approval?
It was a comment that we did consider. I think one of the things that we didn't want to create a system where we were essentially passing our responsibilities off onto New York State. I think that was one of the considerations that we had in that, as we were drafting the guidance document. Certainly that's an area where people can comment on it and make, their recommendations. But to answer your question, I think under our framework, we would not consider whether or not it had received New York State approval on whether or not they would actually have to go through the process outlined in the guidance document.
All right, thank you.
Our next question comes from Mr. Tim Webster.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the panel for the help. Tim Webster from Webster Consulting. So one of the things that I work with is gap analysis for laboratories. Two parts of the question. The first one is there any intention to deputize the CAP to help with this process? And the second one is the idea that some tests are currently FDA approved or cleared while competitors are not. During this process, does this mean that marketing will be able to talk about FDA-approved tests once we've gone through this process? Thank you.
So regarding the first question, certainly in the guidance document we've outlined the idea that we would like to work with third-party reviewers and inspectors in order to assist FDA with our workload, but also particularly for the moderate risk tests, but also to allow an alternative to FDA review so that laboratories can maybe choose a third party to do their reviews or inspections that they're more familiar with. If accreditation organizations wanted to participate in this program, we would be happy for them to do so, but we can't prospectively plan for a group to take part in this type of activity. Now, with respect to your second question, tests already can note what their status is, so in their marketing materials. So if they're a Class 3 device, they can, and they've received, approval of a PMA submission, they can say that they have, FDA approval. If they're a 510K device, they can indicate that they have clearance.
Thanks very much.
Our last question is from Mr. Ruta. Your line is open, sir.
Yeah, hi, it's Martin Ruda. So I'm from CBER and appreciate all the effort of our colleagues at CDRH. This has been a great webcast. And I wanted to thank Richard Robinson for his question, and we appreciate that, and we can try and clarify that. And if you could send it to the docket, that would help.
Thank you, Martin, for that comment. So Dr. Martin Ruda works for the Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research and has indicated that the question about the blood typing is a CBER question, and they can help with that, and that comment should be sent to the docket with all the others.
At this time, there are no questions in the queue.
Thank you. This is Irene here. We appreciate your participation and thoughtful questions. Today's presentation will be available at www.fda.gov/CDRH webinar under the tab titled Past Webinars and Stakeholder Calls 2014. A transcript of this event will also be posted. but may not be available before Friday, October 31st. If you have any additional questions about this guidance, please use the contact information provided at the end of the slide presentation. As always, we appreciate your feedback. Again, thank you for participating, and this concludes today's webinar.
Thank you. Audio participants may disconnect at this time. Thank you for joining our conference.